Hello, it's Brandy, and I have so much to tell you about this book. So this is The Intermediaries, and I wrote it and we published it this year. It came out in May, just ahead of Pride Month in June 2025. And 2025 has been a hell of a year, frankly, so far. So it's kind of good timing, right? It is a story about, it's a history of science. It is a history of politics. It's a history of fear. It's looking at an awful lot of things, but essentially it takes a look at the Weimar era in Berlin, the period between the First and Second World Wars, to ask a couple of really hard questions. Number one, how did people come to hate? How did we get Nazis, essentially? How did that happen? And you have to go back a ways. You have to go back to the 19th century and a real fear of women's rights, a kind of misogyny that led to a very toxic masculinist culture. Well, there was already a masculinist culture, but even more toxic, the Übermensch ideology of Uber males, right? And this joins forces with anti-LGBTQ sentiment, because one of the things that the Nazis continually harp on is how gays and transgender people are not masculine enough. And there's this sense that they attack them for that, and they attack the Jews that way too. And the Institute for Sexual Science, which this book talks a lot about, was established by Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a gay Jewish man living in Berlin, and he had this radical notion that in fact gender wasn't binary, and that it was a spectrum. At one point he said there were like 41 million combinations, which is just a lot of combinations, actually. But it's a wonderful story because he was using science, the early science of hormones, so early endocrine discoveries, basically leading him to understand that it was completely natural. It was part of nature's variation that there were homosexuals. And he called what we today consider to be transgender people, he called them intermediaries. And he thought that they were part of nature's diverse forms. And in fact, at his institute, they had surgeons and they were doing hormone therapy. And one of the first gender reassignment surgery in the way that we typically think about them happens to Dora Richter. And she is this wonderful pioneer. She's not super famous because she's just a person, just like any of us. And her biggest claim to fame is that she lived with joy and authenticity. And joy is a radical weapon. So it's a story of a time period where things looked like they were going to be permissible. They were fighting against the laws that made homosexuality illegal. They were fighting for the rights of transgender people to live and dress and be named the way that they felt that they should be. And Hirschfeld led that charge. But it's also the story of the backlash to that and exactly where that comes from. And also, what happens when you have this Nazi sentiment? How do you fight it? Because they were really good at fighting it. They really were. And it's not a story of how they completely lost. If anything, it's like Star Wars. They were a remnant. People did survive, and they did move on. They seeded other organizations in other countries, and Dora Richter herself outlives the Nazis. So while we are living in this time period right now, where we're seeing attacks on LGBTQ, particularly against transgender, we can know that that happened over 100 years ago, that the Nazis also targeted the LGBTQ community because it was sort of a trial run for things they were going to do later, where they were going to continue. They also were interested in science, not real science, but pseudoscience. Instead of looking at hormone science and endocrinology, they were interested in eugenics, taking gene science, actual science, but twisting it to political ends and manipulating it. So what you end up with is this very horrible idea that only some lives are worth living. And of course, Hitler takes that to the ultimate extreme after 1933 and on, with his attacks on the Jews, with his attacks on transgender people and immigrants and women and other Germans, and ultimately results in the Holocaust. So we know where hatred will take us, but we also know that our enemies have feet of clay, because they can't stand against unified joy. They cannot last. They will turn on each other. They ultimately crumble. They do so much damage on the way. And that's, I think, what we all feel really crushed by right now. But what gives me hope is that in this period, this is right as the Nazis are rising, what we consider to be the darkest time in our time, darkest history in our timeline, you had people coming together for joy and living authentically and recognizing that you have a right to your happiness, and that you shouldn't just be crushed and feel no happiness and no joy, and because that's the way they want you to be. And as we know, the dancing, the singing, the loving, the falling in love, the going to balls, the being your true self, that's actually where the power is. So I hope that you will join me to talk about this book. I hope you will read it and download it and listen to it on Audible and all the other ways that you can reach it, and be part of this growing community of people who know that we have a history, that we've always been here, that we belong, and that we're not going anywhere anytime soon.
You can join me at the Peculiar Book Club on June 26th at 7 p.m. with special guest Eric Garcia.